It was the silence I moved for. The endless, oppressive symphony of the city, the sirens, the arguments through thin walls, the relentless hum of a million lives stacked on top of each other, had worn me down to a raw nerve. I'm a freelance architect, or at least I was trying to be. My work required focus, a quiet space where blueprints and dreams could merge without the jarring interruption of a car alarm. So I cashed in my meager savings, left the suffocating embrace of São Paulo, and bought a small, isolated house in the rural hills of Minas Gerais. It was old, bordered by a dense, ancient stretch of the Atlantic forest, and utterly, beautifully silent. For the first week, it was bliss. My name is Leo. I'm a man who has always prided himself on logic. I believe in physics, in measurable phenomena, in the solid, tangible reality of wood, stone, and steel. The supernatural was a genre of fiction, a funhouse mirror for our primal fears, nothing more. My new home was my sanctuary of reason. The days were spent sketching at my large oak desk, looking out the window as sunlight dappled through the canopy of imposing Jequitiba and Peroba trees. The nights were filled with a profound quiet I hadn't realized I was starving for. The house itself had character. Thick stone walls, a scent of old wood and damp earth, floors that creaked with the weight of history. I was a rational man in a rational, albeit rustic setting. I was in control. The first time I heard it, I dismissed it as the wind. It was a faint, sibilant sound, like leaves skittering across a dry path. It came from the edge of the woods that bordered my property, a wall of green so thick it seemed to swallow the light. But the air that evening was perfectly still. Not a single leaf on the jacaranda tree near my porch trembled. I stood there listening, a mug of cooling coffee in my hand. The sound rose and fell, a strange, inconsistent whisper that seemed to have no source. It was easy to rationalize. Wind behaves strangely around dense foliage, acoustic quirks of the landscape. I went back inside, pulled the curtains, and put on some music. But the sound persisted over the next few days, always at the edge of my hearing, always from the woods. It was most noticeable during the liminal hours of dawn and dusk, when the world was painted in shades of gray and my mind was less guarded. I started to notice patterns, a cadence that was almost vocal. It wasn't just the mindless hiss of air. It was a murmur, like a crowd of people talking in a distant room, their words blurred into a single, cohesive sound. I tried to convince myself it was an auditory illusion, my city-acclimatized brain trying to find familiar patterns in the unfamiliar silence. A form of pareidolia for the ears. My initial skepticism, my bedrock of logic, was a fortress. I walked to the edge of the woods, peering into the deep, humid shadows. Nothing. Just the scent of decay and life, intertwined. The whispering would stop the moment I got too close, as if a shy animal had noticed my approach. I'd stand there, feeling foolish, surrounded by an unnerving silence that now felt more like an absence of sound than genuine peace. My vulnerability, I reasoned, was the move itself. The isolation was getting to me faster than I'd anticipated. I missed the easy anonymity of the city, the reassuring presence of others. Here, I was alone, and my mind was playing tricks on me. One afternoon, I decided to record it. I set up my high-quality microphone on the porch, pointed it directly at the tree line, and let it run for an hour as dusk settled. I sat inside, watching the recording levels on my laptop. Nothing. The software registered only the gentle, ambient noise of the evening, the chirp of a distant cricket, the flutter of a bat. And yet, with my own ears, I could hear it. A low, continuous whisper just beyond the glass of the window. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. It wasn't a physical sound. It was either in my head, meaning I was losing my grip, or it was something else. Something that didn't obey the laws of acoustics. Both possibilities were terrifying. My belief in my control over my own reality began to develop its first hairline crack. The turning point came a week later. I had a video call with a client, a man named Ricardo, who was thankfully as much of a skeptic as I was. We were discussing the stress loads for a new commercial building when he suddenly paused. "Leo, what's that noise?" he asked, frowning at his screen. "What noise? I don't hear anything." It sounds like people whispering. A lot of them. Are your windows open? Maybe it's a radio. My blood ran cold. The windows were shut. The house was silent. There's no one here, Ricardo. It's just me. He looked unconvinced, annoyed. Well, whatever it is, it's distracting. Can you sort it out? I muted my microphone, my hand trembling. He could hear it. Through the digital compression of a video call, across hundreds of kilometers, he could hear it. But I, sitting in the very room where the sound was supposedly originating, could hear nothing but the frantic thumping of my own heart. The whispers were no longer just outside. They were selective. They were choosing who could hear them. The fortress of my logic didn't just crack. A foundational stone crumbled into dust. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the old house was a footstep. Every shadow in the corner of my eye was a watching figure. The gentle murmur from the woods had taken on a malicious, intentional quality. It was a secret being told, one I was not yet meant to fully understand. My sanctuary had become a cage, and the silence I had craved was now a canvas for a sound that should not exist. My desperate search for answers began the next morning, fueled by coffee and a primal fear I was only just beginning to comprehend. The subtle incursion was over. Something had crept into my world, and I knew, with a certainty that defied all reason, that it was not going to leave. My investigation started, as most do these days, with a frantic series of Google searches. Whispering Woods, Minas Gerais, acoustic anomalies forest, auditory hallucinations linked to isolation. The results were a useless mix of folklore blogs, scientific papers on schizophrenia, and tourist sites praising the region's natural beauty. There was no mention of anything like what I was experiencing connected to this specific area. My fear was unique, my problem ungoogleable. This only deepened my sense of isolation. Defeated, I turned my attention to the history of the property itself. The real estate agent had been vague, mentioning it had been in the same family for generations before the last of them died out. I drove into the nearest town, a sleepy place called Alvorada da Serra, which consisted of little more than a main street, a church, and a small municipal building that housed the town hall and library in one dusty wing. The librarian was an elderly woman named Dona Elvira. Her face was a roadmap of wrinkles, and her eyes, sharp and intelligent, seemed to look right through my polite, fabricated excuse about being a history enthusiast researching my new home. She was the town's keeper of stories, the herald of its hidden past. "The old Carvalho place," she said, her voice raspy. She pushed her glasses up her nose and peered at me over the rims. "Not many people have lived there for long. It has a reputation." "A reputation?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "The land is old, older than the town. People say it doesn't like to be disturbed. They say it talks." My heart hammered against my ribs. "Talks? What do you mean?" "Whispers," she said, her voice dropping. "Susurros na mata, whispers in the woods. Old stories, the kind of thing people tell their children to keep them from wandering off. They say the whispers promise things, knowledge, secrets. But the price is too high." She saw the look on my face, the raw terror I couldn't hide. Her expression softened with a hint of pity. "You've heard them, haven't you, son?" I could only nod, the admission feeling like a confession of madness. Dona Elvira sighed and led me to a back room filled with yellowing archives and the smell of brittle paper. She pulled out a heavy ledger of property records and a box of microfiche. The Carvalho family owned that land for over 200 years. But the last ones, that was a tragedy. Back in the 1930s, the entire family, Jonas Carvalho, his wife, and their 2 children, vanished, simply disappeared. She set me up at a clunky microfiche reader and found the local newspaper reels from 1938. As I scrolled through the grainy black and white pages, the story unfolded. At first, it was a simple missing persons report. Then, it became a statewide mystery. The police found the house undisturbed. A meal was half-eaten on the table. There were no signs of struggle, no footprints leading away from the property. They had just ceased to be. The key, the object that shattered my world, was mentioned in the final article about the case being closed. A police sergeant, quoted in the piece, spoke of a journal they'd found belonging to Jonas Carvalho. He described it as the ramblings of a disturbed mind. Jonas wrote obsessively about the whispers from the woods. He believed they were the spirits of the land, ancient and wise. At first he was afraid, just as I was. But then, his fear turned to fascination. He started listening, trying to decipher the words. He wrote that they were offering him the quiet truth, a way to understand the universe. The final entry, dated the day before his family disappeared, was a single, chilling sentence. Tonight, they have invited me to listen properly. We are going to the heart of the woods to finally understand. They say we do not need our bodies to hear. I felt a wave of vertigo so intense I had to grip the sides of the reader. It wasn't a curse. It wasn't a ghost. It was a predator, a lure. It promised enlightenment, but delivered only oblivion. Jonas Carvalho hadn't been insane. He had been a victim, just as I was now a potential one. I understood then with horrifying clarity, there was no escape. This thing wasn't tied to the house, it was tied to the land, and I was living right on top of it. My desperate search for answers had only revealed my own powerlessness. The whispers weren't a symptom of my isolation, they were the cause of Jonas's annihilation. I stumbled out of the library into the harsh afternoon sun, my mind reeling. The normal world, the cars driving by, the children laughing in the town square, felt like a distant dream. I was separated from it by a terrible secret. I drove home in a daze, the lush green landscape that had once seemed so beautiful now looking sinister, predatory. That evening, I called my best friend David. He was the most rational person I knew, an engineer who saw the world in terms of solvable problems. I told him everything, my voice cracking with a mix of fear and desperation. I told him about the whispers, about Ricardo hearing them over the call, about the librarian and the story of the Carvalho family. His reaction was exactly what I should have expected. Concern, yes, but steeped in infuriating skepticism. "Leo, listen to yourself, man," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You're alone out there. You've been under a lot of stress. It's a classic folie à deux scenario, but induced by suggestion. You read an old ghost story, and now your mind is filling in the blanks. And the thing with Ricardo, a bad connection, an audio glitch, anything. It's real, David," I insisted, my voice rising. "I'm not crazy. I'm not saying you're crazy. I'm saying you're stressed and isolated. You need a break. Come back to the city for a weekend. Clear your head. We'll go out, have a beer, forget about all this nonsense." His refusal to believe me was a physical blow. It was the final wall of my isolation cementing itself into place. Not only was I facing an unknowable horror, but I was facing it utterly alone. The world of reason had cast me out. After I hung up, a profound sense of despair washed over me. I was trapped. Running away, as David suggested, felt pointless. The whispers weren't just a sound, they were an awareness. They knew I was listening. Leaving the property might not be enough. What if they could follow? The moment of total vulnerability was realizing that my greatest enemy wasn't the entity in the woods, but my own sanity, which was now under direct, sustained assault. The revelation was not just that the monster was real, but that no one would ever believe me. The aftermath of my discovery was a rapid, terrifying descent. The whispers changed. They were no longer a vague, indistinct murmur from the edge of the woods. They had breached the perimeter of the house. I would hear them slithering from the dark corners of my study, from the empty space beneath my bed, from the silent telephone receiver. They were testing me, growing bolder now that they had my full attention. My home, once a symbol of escape and peace, had become a pressure cooker of dread. They started using my name. It would come as a soft, drawn-out hiss when I least expected it. "Leo!" The sound would curl into my ear from an unseen source, a chillingly intimate violation. It was the sound of a predator that knows its prey is cornered. My life shrank to the four walls of the house. I stopped working. I barely ate. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford, a state of vulnerability I dared not enter. I'd sit up all night in a single armchair in the living room, a lamp casting a lonely circle of light around me, every muscle tense, listening. The entity's attacks became more psychological, more personal. It began to mimic voices. One afternoon, I heard my mother, who had been dead for 10 years, calling my name from the kitchen. Her voice was perfect, filled with the warmth I remembered so vividly. For a heart-stopping moment, grief and hope warred with terror. I almost went to her. But then, her sweet tone was undercut by that sibilant, collective whisper, a discordant harmony that twisted the memory into something monstrous. They were using my own past, my own love, as a weapon against me. Desperate, I tried to fight back. I boarded up the windows facing the woods, a futile gesture against something that wasn't physical. I blasted music through speakers day and night, trying to drown out the whispers with Vivaldi, with rock, with anything that was loud and human. But it was like trying to block out the stars with a sieve. In the brief pauses between songs, or in the soft passages of a symphony, the whispers would return, sounding amused, patient. My friend David, true to his word but misinterpreting my terror as a cry for help, drove up to see me a week later. He took one look at my haggard appearance, the wild look in my eyes, the boarded-up windows, and his face filled with pity. This was my skeptic, my last link to the rational world, and he saw a man having a breakdown. "Leo, this has gone too far," he said, his voice laced with concern. "Look at this place. Look at you. You have to get out of here. I'll help you pack." "You don't understand," I pleaded, my voice hoarse. "Leaving won't stop it. It knows me now. It's attached to me." "What is it?" he demanded, his patience finally snapping. "There is nothing here. It's an old house making old house noises. It's the wind. It's your own mind turning on you from the solitude." As he spoke, a floorboard in the hallway behind him creaked loudly. We both turned. The hallway was empty, steeped in shadow. Then, from the deepest part of that darkness, a clear, multi-layered whisper echoed, a sound that was both quiet and deafeningly present. "He's not leaving." David froze. The color drained from his face. His eyes were wide with a disbelief so pure it bordered on agony. He had heard it, unequivocally. For a single, triumphant moment, I felt vindicated. I wasn't crazy, but that triumph was immediately swallowed by a new, colder fear. Now he was in danger too. The entity had revealed itself to him, marking him. What was that?" he stammered, taking a step back. "That's what I've been trying to tell you," I said, my voice grim. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices speaking over one another, swirling around us from all directions. They spoke in fragments, in half-sentences, promising David the same secrets they had offered to Jonas, to me. They told him they knew his fears, his ambitions. They offered him answers. David didn't hesitate. He turned and ran. He didn't say goodbye, didn't look back. He scrambled into his car and sped away, gravel flying from beneath his tires. I watched him go, and the last of my ties to the world I once knew was severed. He was my ally, the one person who might have helped, and now he had become a victim, fleeing for his own sanity. His abandonment was the ultimate proof of the horror's reality. I was completely, utterly alone, left to face a malevolent intelligence that was now openly, aggressively, trying to consume me. My sanity wasn't just disintegrating, it was being actively dismantled piece by piece by an enemy I could not see, could not touch, and could not possibly defeat. The weeks that followed David's flight were a blur of sleepless paranoia. The whispers were my constant companions, a relentless chorus that narrated my waking nightmare. They no longer bothered with subtlety. They chanted my name, recounted my failures, and promised an end to my suffering if I would just come outside and listen. The house was no longer a shelter but a tomb I was occupying before my death. My architectural sketches lay abandoned, gathering dust, relics from a life that felt like it belonged to another person. I was no longer Leo, the architect. I was a cornered animal, a mind besieged. I learned the entity's rules through pain and terror. It was strongest in silence and darkness. It fed on fear, and even more so on curiosity. The more I tried to understand it, the more footholds I gave it in my mind. The story of Jonas Carvalho became my gospel and my curse. He had listened, he had engaged, and he had been erased. My only chance, I realized, was to do the opposite. I had to achieve a state of pure, thoughtless denial. I had to make my mind a fortress of noise. The confrontation came on a moonless, starless night. A storm had been brewing all day, and as dusk fell, the sky broke open. Rain lashed against the house, and wind howled through the trees, creating a symphony of natural chaos. For a while, it was a relief. The storm's fury drowned out the whispers. But then, the power flickered and died. The lights went out. My generator failed to kick in. I was plunged into absolute darkness and a sudden, profound silence as the storm's initial rage momentarily subsided. And in that silence, they came for me. It started with a single whisper from the darkest corner of the living room. "We are here, Leo." Then another, from the hallway. "We have so much to show you." Within seconds, the house was filled with them. The sound was overwhelming, a physical pressure inside my skull. They were everywhere, in the walls, under the floor, inside my own head. They gave up on persuasion and moved to sheer force. The air grew impossibly cold. I could feel an unseen pressure on my chest, a weight of ages that sought to crush the breath from my lungs. This was it. The final push. They were going to take me, just like they took the Carvalhos. In that suffocating darkness, a desperate, primal instinct for survival took over. I couldn't fight what I couldn't see. I couldn't run from what was already inside my head. But I remembered Jonas's final mistake. He went to listen. My only weapon was to refuse the invitation. I clapped my hands over my ears, pressing until it was painful. I started screaming, not in terror, but in defiance. I screamed nonsense words, childhood songs, multiplication tables, anything to fill the space in my mind. The whispers grew louder, angrier, trying to force their way through my mental barricade. I stumbled through the dark, bumping into furniture, my own voice raw and cracking. I had to get out of the house. I had to get to the woods. It was an insane thought, running toward the source of the terror, but I knew I couldn't win a siege. Maybe, just maybe, I could disrupt the ritual. I threw open the front door and ran out into the raging storm. Rain and wind hit me with physical force. Barefoot, I ran across the muddy lawn toward the wall of black trees. Yes, the whispers seemed to sing, a triumphant chorus in my mind. Come and listen. But I didn't stop at the edge. I plunged into the woods, into the entity's heartland. Branches whipped at my face. Roots tripped my feet. It was madness, but it was my madness. I wasn't coming to listen. I was bringing my own noise. I kept screaming, a wild, continuous roar of defiance against the storm and the ancient evil that surrounded me. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, collapsing into the wet leaves and mud at the base of a giant tree. Lying there, gasping for air, I waited for the end. The whispers swirled around me, furious, confused. My act of irrational defiance had broken their script. I had accepted their invitation but refused their terms. I closed my eyes and focused on one thing: the feeling of the cold mud on my skin, the rain on my face, the pain in my lungs. Physical reality, my reality. I clung to it like a drowning man to a raft. And slowly, imperceptibly, the pressure in my mind began to recede. The storm raged on, but the unnatural chorus within it started to fade, replaced by the simple, clean sound of the wind and rain. I had survived, but survival is not victory. I don't know how long I lay there. Eventually, the first gray light of dawn filtered through the canopy. The storm had passed. The world was washed clean. I was bruised, scratched, and trembling with exhaustion and cold. But I was alive. And I was alone. The whispers were gone. I sold the house for a fraction of what I paid, not caring about the loss. I never told the new owners why. I moved back to the city, not to São Paulo, but to an even bigger, louder metropolis. I live in a high-rise apartment now, surrounded by the constant, glorious noise of traffic, neighbors, and life. I never allow for silence. Music is always playing, the TV is always on. Silence is a vacuum, and I know what rushes in to fill it. I am a scarred man. I survived, But the Leo, who tended his garden and sketched blueprints in the quiet afternoon light, is gone forever. In his place is a haunted man who jumps at sudden lulls in conversation and can't sleep without the drone of a fan. The knowledge of what exists just beyond the veil of our perceived reality is a permanent wound. The evil was not defeated. I simply fled its territory. I live with the terrible truth that we are not alone, and that there are voices in the dark places of the world that call to us. And sometimes, even now, in the split second of quiet between a passing siren and the beat of a song, I think I can hear a faint, distant whisper on the edge of my hearing, a reminder that I was listened to, and that I will never be truly free.